All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast-to-coast radio show all about the information economy. It's time for Inside Analysis. Yours truly is here with a very special guest. We're going to talk about security, a problem that never goes away. It never will go away. It's always going to be a challenge. It's changing by the day. We're talking to Art Poghosyan. He's a company called Britive. It's Britive. And Art, I'm going to tell you, security, it's one of these issues that only a handful of people at the company ever really care about it. And my British business partner one time cracked a joke. He said, there's only one person who cares about security, and his name is Scapegoat. Meaning the person who was in charge of security just gets blamed when something goes wrong, and they fire that person and get another person. But usually they do the same kind of stuff. But one of the more clever comments I've heard about security over the years, and I think this is very, very true, I'm sure you'll agree with this, is that security is not a thing. It's not one object. It's not a technology. It's not a process. It's a whole amalgam of education, of protocols, of technologies, of observability, and just paying attention. You have to pay attention all the time with this stuff. And I can tell you, folks, in the last 4 or 5 months, I've had my corporate debit card hacked twice, which is annoying. Once is okay, because that way I can see and remember all the stupid things I signed up for. You get all the emails, oh, your credit card was declined. Like, yeah, I know, because it got hacked and I didn't really want to go back to you guys. And luckily, the legislators around the country, here in America at least, have done some good work in not allowing these organizations to keep hammering you with late fees after it goes away. These days, you just don't get your service anymore and it goes away. But nonetheless, the security issue is so important. It's never going to not be important. So you always need this cocktail of technologies and processes. And then even still, you're going to get hacked sooner or later. So what's your path to remediation? There are lots of things to consider here. But in a few choice words here, tell us a bit about yourself and Britive and how you got into this space and what you folks are doing.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me here. I got into security just about 20 years ago. And back then it was more about network security or IT security, as they call it. It's certainly evolved quite a bit since then. It's become, arguably even a board level issue that, that we see today. But hacks or attacks have gone from just a network breach to steal some data to full on cyber warfare or cyber crime. And
Sure.
ransomware is one that is so lucrative these days for the criminals and so disruptive for many companies and industries, right? So it's a very different world today that we live in. My past, experience before this company, before Britive, I've been in a space mostly from consulting and services industry in that industry, and I started also another company about 10 years ago in identity and access management services space, but eventually, which led an exit of that company led to forming Britive, and specifically focusing on a problem in the cloud, space or public cloud technologies, and building a product to the market that helps reduce the security risks and vulnerabilities that are preventing businesses from adopting and expanding their public clouds consumption or their
Right.
cloud adoption.
Right. Well, let's talk about how you do that, because there are lots and lots of ways, and I do like that you're focused on identity management, because let's face it, if you're trying to log into a system, the system is trying to understand, okay, are you the person that you say you are? And historically, that's been largely done by passwords, which of course is a pain because you have to remember the passwords, and a lot of people use the same password for everything, and that of course is putting yourself in jeopardy, because then folks can hack in and do all kind of stuff. And it was my business partner, Dr. Robin Bloor, who years ago taught me that this whole crime network is not just individuals. In fact, the whole narrative around the guy in the hoodie being the one who's going in and hacking your system is very disingenuous. It's not a guy in a hoodie. Sometimes it is, but usually there's this whole industry involved. There are people who specialize in getting access. There are people who specialize in exploiting that access, and then will just kind of sell their access to other players. And then you have cases like the Colonial Pipeline, which some folks may recall a while back, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine took down the East Coast's ability to get gas to gas stations. And, when I saw that, I thought to myself, this is an act of war. This is not just some ransomware. And the government has never come out and said that, but I believe it was an act of war. And it goes to show you how vulnerable we are. So someone actually did the math and figured out, hey, if we hack into these guys, we can shut down distribution on the East Coast, and that will be a very significant inconvenience, and in fact put people in jeopardy, right? Ambulances, things that can't get gasoline, that's a pretty big problem. So it's not just individuals. I mean, to your point, there is cyber warfare that goes on, state-sponsored actors. And I think the folks at Google and Facebook and Yahoo and these other big organizations certainly work very hard to stop all that. But maybe tell us about your role and how you fit into this bigger picture. What do you do to enable identity management that you can then sort of provide to all these cloud providers?
No, that's very good background. Just kind of how you've illustrated like the state of the world really. And for us, why identity was so important and why we decided to really invest in building a technology. There's a very important thing to talk about here. With the cloud technologies and adoption of public cloud, there was a huge change in a paradigm shift, really, in the world of security and identity specifically. Back in when all the critical IT assets were in the data center, the security model was to protect the data center from outside in. So there was a perimeter, aside from the walls, of course, but there was a perimeter security network, firewalls and IDS and so on.
Right.
And identities existed inside the firewall. With public cloud, that was a complete opposite. Identity essentially became the first and last line of defense when it comes to cloud infrastructure and applications and so on. That's why identity for us became the first and biggest security, elements to protect. And what that means from like examples you gave, of course, Azure and GCP and AWS, they all have pretty robust security controls and identity models. The challenge is for any organization that operates across different technologies, and they also operate on top of the cloud provider's infrastructure, they have to build their own security controls and security model that goes across the different providers, and they're not uniform. Azure security is very different than AWS, and it's very different from GCP, especially when it comes to how they protect the identity and how they protect the access. That's why Britive came to market with a solution that works across the cloud providers. Another very important thing that we did, and this was something that we saw as we were entering the market, we saw a huge issue with what we call this overprivileged access. So a lot of times, organizations with intention to bring products and new applications to market to support their businesses and growth, really had to do things from security standpoint in a way that are not ideal, like giving a lot of access to users, assuming they're going to need that, or they maybe need it at some point, but no longer need it later. That created this risk exposure, when access existed, but nobody needed it.
Right.
Well, of course, attackers love that situation.
Right.
And that's why we started seeing breach after breach. Capital One was one of the earliest like cloud privileged access breaches that we came to know about. And that speaks to one problem that we noticed early on, how the current access or the traditional access model didn't really translate well to cloud. What I mean by that is when you give somebody access with assumption they need it 24/7, and access always sits there, and the only thing that prevents somebody else to gain access is a login name and password. It's a terrible security, and it's a very vulnerable security to protect, right? So we decided to change that. With Britive, we really kind of invented the newer and better way to do it, to eliminate everything when the user doesn't need that access. So when it comes to human users, None of us can sit in front of a computer 24/7 by 365.
Right.
We can do our job at certain hours, but after that, we don't need that access. So what Britive does is automatically grants that access when the user needs, but also removes automatically when that access is no longer needed until the next time the user needs it. That's a massive reduction of the risk exposure and then attack surface.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned something that's interesting. You talked about the models, the security models that these different providers have. And I know for sure that one of the things that you could do to better secure your environment is to identify where someone logs in. What office are they in? Are they in a different office than they normally are in? And that would be in a profile around the user. So the identity management of Chuck, let's say, is that he dials in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's where he works. And if he goes traveling somewhere, wouldn't it be great to know that he's traveling? And of course, these banks have systems that don't always work very well where they say, hey, are you going to be traveling? And you say, yes, I'll be traveling to Austria next week. So if my credit card comes across in Austria, it's me. So don't block me out when I'm trying to log into my systems from Austria. Well, that's a nice way to do it, but it's expensive. It's a bit time intensive. But these days, it seems to me it should be relatively easy if you have the right technology in place to identify the pattern of what is normal. And the normal pattern for Chuck would be he logs in at 9 a.m., he logs out at 5 p.m. kind of deal. And if he logs in at 2 o'clock in the morning, oh, well, maybe you kick in an extra security loop to say, are you really you? And of course, people know these captchas. The captchas drive me completely bonkers. I hate it, especially on my phone, because I'm like, I just give up. I'm like, I won't go in. I don't care. I'm not going to go. Is this a bike? Is this a bike? Is this a, okay. It's very annoying. But the point I'm making here is that you can build a profile around the user and then understand who that person is. And when they're doing things like they normally do, you still have security, but at least it's a lower level of security. When they're doing things they're not normally doing, that's when you kick in a higher level of security. Is that about right?
That's 100% right. And you're correct that technology today has come a long way in being able to actually do that and do it with minimal disruption. To your point, captchas were invented, what, 20 years ago?
Right.
I think, to expand on that a little bit, right? I think, yes, there's a lot of opportunity to improve that, both from security and the end user's experience standpoint. So one of the things that we're doing along those lines, when you look at a pretty significant number of users for Britive or involves cloud developers, DevOps engineers, and so on.
Right.
These folks just have to do a lot of different things during the day, and there's definitely it's not a very static sort of a linear pattern of work. So they jump around a lot doing this here and something else there. What we try to do is gather activity across, during the day across the environments that they were in and doing whatever an engineer could do with standing up a storage, or compute instance or whatnot. So we can actually look at that data from the pattern standpoint over time and say, over, let's say, 90 days, the normal pattern for this type of user has been X, Y, and Z. Why that's important is because we could also detect when something goes completely in a different direction one day, right? So that allows us to kick off alerts and triggers to say something is not looking and feeling right. So the security teams can quickly take a look and understand, is it normal? There could be a legitimate instance of that situation, but we'd rather verify that than let it go, right? So that helps us also enhance the model of like what we should give to whom, because that also helps the data, same data, analyzing the data helps us understand what next batch of users, what is the normal pattern of access they should need.
Right.
So we can make those grants very easily and get people what they need immediately.
But basically, if I understand it, security has to sit in between systems, right? So someone is on the outside, they're trying to get in to a cloud environment that may have 8, 10, 12, 20 different applications. And, you made a good point about developers. I have developer friends, and they tell me that the biggest pain in their job is just logging back into the system, logging back into that system. people in the consumer world know you have all these different protocols. Oh, it's got to be 10 characters and a special character, and it can't be 2 characters side by side, like, 2 characters in a row. All these goofy sort of just bespoke rules that mean you have to come up with different passwords. And then, of course, Google allows you to do that password management feature in their system, and that's what I use. But of course, if someone hacks into that, now they've got access to all your stuff. I mean, these security issues, the sword cuts both ways, right? The old adage, every sword cuts both ways. I always thought about the key fob. I'm like, oh, key fob, that's great. Unless someone gets your key fob and they can walk through the parking lot just going like this till they find your car and get in and drive away. So it's like some of these security measures wind up being security risks, essentially. How do you balance that out? And how do you sit in between? So when you actually deploy to a particular client, you're sitting sort of in a layer outside of their environment, but can you also get in to track what they're moving? Tell us about that quickly.
Yeah, and early in my career in the security space, somebody said this, and it really stuck in my head. The best security is invisible security, so the end user can't see there. It's been very hard to actually get to that stage, but I think we're getting definitely we're moving in the right direction. We're not quite there.
Yeah. Hey, I'm
Yes,
realizing we're up at our first break. So stand by, hold that thought. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. Okay, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, you're truly Eric Kavanagh with Art Poghosyan of Britive, Britive. We're talking all about security, getting access to systems, how annoying security can be, but how important it is, because when someone gets in, especially with ransomware, and they hold all your stuff hostage, like I said, the Colonial Pipeline shows you how much can be held hostage. Major hospitals have been held hostage by these things, and that's a real problem. But Art, you were talking a moment ago about how the ideal security is invisible security, which, under the covers can be very powerful these days because you can test all kinds of things, right? Where is this person? What device is it? I mean, to me, that's one of the key characteristics, right? Is like, is this the device that the person normally uses? I think that's why you see so much focus on these mobile devices these days. And there it is. Because there's a signature, there's an IP address, and there's the unique signature of that device. If I'm using that device and it's with me, et cetera, then okay, that's probably a good person to grant access to. But tell us more about this invisible security and how you folks do it.
Yeah. So how we approach this is certainly a combination of different things, and it does include something you mentioned, right? So instead of constantly being disruptive and forcing the user to re-authenticate or prove to the system who they are, we use data. We use some things that we can gather without interfering with the user and their activity in the system. That helps us be fairly confident that this is still a legitimate user. There's also systems that we gather that outside of Britive that we gather that from. So like the authentication service provider, which could be anything from Microsoft Azure to Okta or whatnot, they do have data that is very valuable. We also gather some of our own data that helps us prove and validate the user. Ultimately, though, I think there's definitely enough awareness already, even in the end user communities, that security is very important. So if we are going to essentially enforce certain security rules along the process, that we do it in a way that they understand why this is important, especially in communities like developers, right? Because they deal with a lot of very sensitive infrastructure and data. Right. So we do have some control in place that when the time and the trigger is there, we need to enforce. So one of them would be to let's say have them re-authenticate or step up authenticate, as we call it, to prove that they are still a legitimate user. Ultimately, the goal is to make it least disruptive and allow them to do their job.
I would have to think that the vast majority of breach incidents occur upon logging. In other words, if someone's logged in already, usually they're going to be working. I suppose they could walk away and not log out, that kind of thing, and then someone could come up to their machine. I mean, that does happen, but I'm just guessing that the vast majority of breaches are at login time. a fresh cold breach. Is that right?
Um, Candidly, I don't know what the stats are truly about that, but that is definitely a
A good
very
guess.
likely scenario. It's a good guess. Yeah, it's when once a user is in the session, right? That's now an active session that if the hacker was able to um, it used to be this type of attack called man in the middle. So
Hmm.
if that was the scenario, then yeah, the legitimate user wouldn't even know somebody else is piggybacking on that session, right? I think there's another very concerning trend in the growing type of attacks is when the interactive user or human user is not even involved. For example, again, when it comes to cloud technologies, there's a lot that's already visible and accessible through APIs, and attackers would love to just exploit that rather than trying to exploit a user session, right?
Right.
And that's where we also have, again, as an industry, we're playing a catch-up game here, trying to protect these non-interactive, doors and access points into cloud data and cloud applications. So, for example, how Britive does that is we have this concept of non-human, or synthetic or machine identity, as they call it, that we allow the customers to define any process, any technology that requires access to their infrastructure and data to authenticate, much like a human being, and provide that like validation that who who they or as a non-human identity or machine identity, who it is and what
Hmm.
functionality, what API, what service they can access before they allow that, right? So
Hmm.
this again adds another component of security here, that instead of just assuming whoever's accessing the API is legitimate, trust and verify.
Hmm. Yeah, I love the trust and verify thing. And you bring up a really good point about API access and just machine to machine conversations, right? Which happen all the time, constantly. And these APIs are hit 24/7. So is that a new security threat or a relatively new security threat of people mimicking machine behavior in order to get behind an API, grab some information, pull it back out? It looks normal. It looks like the normal call that goes from Intuit, QuickBooks to my bank, for example, back and forth. I mean, those are the really precious connections to infiltrate, right? Is when you're going from one place to another. And I mean, I remember, I think the target breach came in through an HVAC system or something, through an IoT system. So it's like,
Exactly.
wow, it wasn't some user, it was the machine to machine conversation that was co opted. And that's just as dangerous as any human login, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that was an excellent example. The problem is again, legacy type of mindset and approaches don't work when it comes to cloud. What I mean, for example, to detect a user, like human user breach, typically security would review the human login attempts.
Hmm.
They wouldn't necessarily look at API login attempts.
Right.
So it's a fundamental issue of is there enough visibility? Is there enough data that's being sort of filtered and reviewed through security processes to detect all possible access points? Arguably, most organizations miss that, miss something. That's why breaches keep happening.
Right. Yeah, and that, as we suggest, that can be all that's necessary to get into a system. What should, in terms of the API management stuff, how do you solve for that? I mean, does your technology have a sort of pattern recognition component where you can watch normal behavior for a period of time and say, okay, this looks normal. Then once you've defined normal, you can define what is abnormal. Is that kind of how your security technology works?
Um, uh, I certainly don't want to sound like we can do anything and everything, to be honest
Right.
with you. I think the API type of use case is, it's fair to say our approach has been mostly to try to standardize and make it similar to the human interactive model, where security controls can be enforced kind of more as a matter of a guardrail or a gate or security control upon time of that access, right? So
Hmm.
like as I was describing that process that's calling the API has to prove and validate, and be sort of on the whitelist before they really allow. When it comes to like really defining patterns for the non-human interactive, that I would say is kind of more of a next stage problem. It's just because it's so much more complex than tracking like the human activity. It's one of the most complex problems that needs to be solved still.
Yeah, and well, so let's talk about the multi-cloud side of the equation here. That is a very useful bit of functionality, I can tell you from a business perspective, because I don't want to have to care about the difference between Azure and GCP and Amazon Web Services. You folks can care about that, and you folks can care about adhering to their protocols, which I'm guessing they update on some relatively frequent basis. So you have to stay on top of how their protocols change. But of course, with APIs, ideally, you don't want to have to deprecate APIs, right? There are APIs that you want them to stay the same, such that everyone can use it the same way they were using it. But in terms of these different cloud environments, how do you tackle that? I mean, do you have sort of a layer of abstraction that can say, okay, this is for Azure, so use this functionality. This is for GCP, use that functionality. How does that work?
Yeah, it's a great point, actually. That a lot of people don't even think about the whole ongoing aspect of how do you maintain, how do you keep up with a very dynamic world of cloud technologies and APIs. So that's actually one of the inherent benefits of what Britive offers, that we maintain that. We are constantly monitoring and detecting changes and the key functionality that Britive itself relies on, say it's GCP or Azure or whatever functionality that our system depends on to function. That's our job. That's what comes with the value of Britive. That the customers don't have to worry about that. Individually they don't need to monitor, because we do, and that's part of our little bit of our IP of how we do that. So we never become sort of the point of disruption for the customer.
Right. No, that's important. So basically, you are solving for the security challenge across these cloud environments for companies that have people using AWS for one thing, using Azure for something else, and you just have your profile for the users, and then you just map that to the new environment, basically. Is that right? And you work for
Correct.
You do all the three major ones. Is that right?
Actually, we do more than that. We do 4 major ones, including Oracle Cloud Infrastructure.
Okay.
And there's a couple dozen non-infrastructure clouds like Snowflake, ServiceNow, Office 365, and so on.
Mm-hmm. That's a full-time job, man. How big is your company? How many people?
We are 50 full-time team members, but yeah, we're growing fast, and it is full-time and more than that.
What percentage are actual developers and engineers? Like, out of 50 people, what percentage are people who are coders or engineers or people of that technical nature?
80%.
80%, yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds about right. Because you can't stay on top of everything. I mean, each one of these environments keeps changing. They have updates all the time, and you have to stay on top of that stuff. It's changing rapidly these days, it seems to me. How concerned, we got a couple minutes left here, how concerned are you about quantum computing and quantum going mainstream, which IBM, I guess, indicates should be happening in 2 to 5 years or so? Because one of the concerns I've heard is that with quantum computing, all traditional encryption goes out the window, and you're going to have a very hard time dealing with it. Now, in my simple mind, I'm thinking to myself, well, there still are tactics you can put in place to rebuff those sorts of attacks, like distributed denial of service attacks, things of this nature. There are things you can put in place to throttle those things, but overall, it does seem to be a very significant risk that's coming down the pike. What are your thoughts about quantum, and what can we do about it?
I'll be very quick. So I think it's revolutionary for sure, right? And it's going to definitely have deep impact on security. But I also know a lot of times the breaches and attacks happen because of very basic issues and like not following security hygiene more than not having strong enough encryption in place. Right. So I think as an industry, we need to get our act together, first of all, to eliminate like these easy paths for attackers to get in. But with quantum, I think it's also the benefit of having better technology for security as well. So if it's leveraged properly, then we will also have better defense.
Right. So it goes both ways, basically. The good guys
Goes
get it, the
both
bad
ways.
guys get it. Right.
Get it? Yeah.
It is, that we're talking about a cashless society. Everyone's talking about a cashless society today. I'm not going to lie, that does concern me. I know that you can counterfeit printed dollars, but you can also hack into someone's account and make the money go away. And our most recent hack on my debit card, it made it look like it was Google ads, like we were just buying Google ads. And lucky for me, we don't buy Google ads. So I'm like, that's interesting. They have a whole bunch of, and they started small and they started ramping up. It was like $20, $70, $42, $150. I'm like, wait a minute. Well, why am I broke again? I know I'm not that foolish. And yeah, because I was hacked again. I just, it frustrates the end user to have these experiences, because you think, shouldn't the banks be on this kind of stuff? Shouldn't the banks be watching for these kinds of things? And if you get into the system where you can be in the banking world transferring money back and forth, well, you have to have some identity somewhere that can be trapped and managed, right? I mean, I'm kind of fascinated at how effective these bad guys are at infiltrating banking systems, because there has to be a signature of where they came from. Right. I mean, I know in the security world, a lot of times they use proxies to kind of bounce around from place to place, so you can't tell where they came from. But when you're pulling money out, I mean, you're grabbing all kinds of metadata of what system it was on, what the operating system was, what the browser was, what the location was. All that stuff gets captured. I'm kind of surprised we don't have more success, or maybe we do, and I just don't hear about it. What are your closing thoughts on just the state of security in this world, and why it's still such a problem?
Yeah, and certainly the industry has come a long way. Again, 20 years has been a long enough time for me to see that. I really still think that, security's job, it was an interesting, comment you made earlier, is that about the security being the scapegoat, right? It's a very tough job to have, because they always have to balance security versus a business, priorities and objectives, and especially interfering anything that's important for the business, right? So,
Right.
and there's inevitably trade-offs. Inevitably, it always comes down to trade-offs. I think that, as an industry, the practitioners out there in the field, make decisions, and sometimes, hopefully most of the time, those are the right decisions. Sometimes they're not, and you see outcome, you see consequences. From the vendor community, I think we are really making some really big headways into bringing technologies to the practitioners, to the CISOs of the world, to actually make that balance or decision easier, where security doesn't have to cost productivity, security doesn't have to cost the business agility, and so on.
Right.
That's, I think, as an industry, we're making a big step towards, right? I feel like that's for the next decade or so, this would be a huge factor in how we improve the overall posture of the industry and the security.
Well, that sounds good, Art. Well, thank you so much for your time, folks. We've been talking to Art Poghosyan. Look him up online, Britive, BRITIVE.com. We'll be back. You are listening to Inside Analysis. Okay, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking all things identity management these days, identity resolution. Who are we? How do the systems we use know who we are and validate us? Obviously, it's a very huge issue. We were just talking to Art from Britive all about that. And I was reminded of some other approaches that some folks are doing, and something that we're actually working on. So a little special treat for our avid listeners. I'm going to give you a sneak preview of something that we've been working on here at Inside Analysis at the Blur Group with some of our partners. And the example I wanted to give, first of all, was my good buddy, Sean Brem from CrowdPoint Technologies, and what they've built. So federated ID is at the heart of their mission. What they've really built is a ecosystem, an e-commerce ecosystem that's based upon a blockchain, a proprietary blockchain that they've built, which also doubles as a database. So it's not just a traditional slow blockchain style data structure, but they've done some very clever things in that regard. But what I find really compelling about their approach is the fact that there are focused on giving value back to the end user for the data of theirs that is used to train algorithms. So if you look at all the hubbub around OpenAI, for example, and these lawsuits that have been filed, what did they basically allege? They say that OpenAI went out and scraped all kinds of content, including copyrighted content, and they used all that material to build out their model, their generative AI model. Well, it's a good argument. If I've used someone's copyrighted material to train my engine, which I then make money from, well, shouldn't the people whose content was used get some piece of that action? And that's traditionally how these things work. I did see just the other day that there was a judgment rendered in a court somewhere in the US that basically said Gen AI generated content cannot be copyrighted. Now, how they would know what engine generated the content in the first place is beyond me. And I think that's frankly an open question, but at least a standard has now been set. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there's going to have to be some more work to be done. I heard that OpenAI also truncated their sniffing engine, their engine that would determine whether or not content was created by an OpenAI engine or a ChatGPT or something like that, which also is interesting. Obviously, they see the lawsuits coming and they know there's something going to happen here. So what does this all mean? Well, I can tell you that these large language models, these foundational models, are absolutely amazing. They are spectacularly powerful, very, very interesting. Yes, we are worried about the trust side of things, but nonetheless, we have to be respectful of the fact that this is going to change how business gets done. So what does that all mean? Well, getting back to federated ID, that was CrowdPoint's vision, and their idea is that they're going to pay attention to when your data is used for something and then pay you for that. Small amounts of money first, pennies, then dimes and dollars down the road, is at least how the theory goes. So that helps solve the identity resolution problem, at least in their world. But what we're going to do here, and this is how I'm going to fuse these topics together here at the end of our show today, is we're creating something that we're calling the rubric. And the rubric is going to use a large language model as its text generation tool or engine. But the moorings, the anchors of truth, the embeddings, if you will, those are going to come from trusted experts. And so what we're going to do is reach out to folks. And if you're interested in this, send me an email, info@insideanalysis.com. If you're an expert in analytics in particular, these are the folks we're looking to talk to first. You could publish your papers or your works, your articles, research reports, etc., in this system that will then use them and other reports, other trusted reports, as the anchors of truth for the rubric to help folks make decisions about which analytic tool to use, how to use it, what other tools can be used in conjunction with it. How could you build a stack, basically? What does the modern analytics stack look like? And we're planning on building that out right now. So it actually uses a technology that I've already had built called Media Lens. And Media Lens, I built it. It's a lens with a Z. It runs a site InsideOpenSource.org right now, inside-opensource.org. And it uses that right now. What I wanted was an engine that I could use to spin up a highly focused stream of content that would be useful for a researcher. So I wanted to stay on top of the open source community. So that's where we targeted first. And all I did was went out and found all these different folks who tweet about open source technologies, who follow their handles. Media Lens tracks that. They track the different handles that I've given them to watch out for. And then what it'll do is it'll grab any URL that is shared by these folks with hashtags like open source or Dremio or Apache or the other terms, the key terms that are associated with that particular industry, and it publishes them as pending posts in my environment, and then I can choose to post them or not. And every time I post, what I'm essentially doing is building out my content lake. And so this is where we're going to use the engine to help find these anchors of truth that will sort of pin down the truth and allow the generative AI functionality to spin appropriate words around the concepts that the prompt delivers. So what are we talking about? I mean, really, if you think about Siri and these other engines that are now currently used for these purposes, they're valuable. They can sort of find information for you, but they're not really trusted experts in a particular domain. And one reason for that is because it would be a big thing to chew off, to bite off, if you will, for the current engine. So right now, Siri is just kind of pointing you to different things on the web or giving you information that is readily available, like the weather or what time a meeting is, things of that nature. But when you start getting into really dense areas of content, like in trade press, like around analytics, for example, well, you're going to need more than that. And that's what we're focused on. So we're focused on finding the right experts to provide their materials in a trusted fashion. And then whenever that material gets used via the rubric by a paying client, the people whose insights were used in that immediate sort of real-time mind meld, they will get rewarded with credits. Now, it's going to take a while to build this thing up, but the point is we're going to try to create a center of gravity around the topic of analytics, because there's a finite number of vendors, there are a finite number of people who focus on this, and we're looking for help to do that. So like I say, if you're hearing this and you think it sounds like a good idea, send me an email, info@dmradio.biz or info@insideanalysis.com. Both of those come directly to me, and we'll be curious to talk to you and maybe show you a preview of this thing. But the idea is that, really right now, folks are paying lots and lots of money for Gartner and Forrester and some of these other consultants, or Boston Consulting Group, a lot of very smart people at these companies, but it's hard to get access to these people, and they are just finite human beings, so they don't know everything, but they know a lot about a particular domain, for example. Well, if you think about the power of these foundational models to piece together vectors of information from multiple sources, if you get to a critical mass of embeddings, and this is the key, you need a critical mass of embeddings from trusted sources, then all of a sudden you have a very interesting, intelligent chatbot that you can counsel to find out information about big decisions, like which technology should we buy, like which technologies work well with each other. That's another very important thing to understand, is a lot of times some technologies don't work together so well and some do. So knowing which technologies work well in which environments, also very useful stuff. Just best practices. I mean, knowing how to go about setting up a SQL statement to find certain pieces of information. I mean, a lot of people know that. A lot of people understand SQL, but nonetheless, a lot of people don't. And we're at this very interesting phase right now in the world. So our rubric is going to be built out as an assistant to help folks understand enterprise technology, get out of the weeds, do some playing around, and get some better answers faster and less expensively, right? Because if you bring together all these smart minds and get good content from people who know what they're talking about, and find ways to weight those scores, to weight the information, and to align it topically, and that's what these embeddings do. I mean, just to kind of cap it off here, embeddings are mathematical representations of text strings. That's really what they boil down to. And what the folks did building these large language models is, they did some amazing work at being able to vectorize information, text. So they turn it into numbers such that you can do statistical analysis more easily and find patterns in data. Okay, this word is used in this context. It's also used in that context. When does it mean this? When does it mean that? These are the kinds of solutions that these large language models can provide. They can give you really good information about what should be in a certain context and what should not. But the key again is the embeddings. The embeddings allow you to get closer and closer to the truth. So I just wanted to tease that fun stuff to you folks. Hop online to InsideAnalysis.com. Send me an email, info@InsideAnalysis.com, if you want to get involved. And we're going to have some fun, folks. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.